Maximize your yields while spreading out your workload with the earliest maturing winter cereal. Visit kws.com/CA to see how our hybrid rye varieties can work for you. High yields, high quality, high value for your farm. KWS, seeding the future since 1856.
All right, I am Lindsay Smith with Real Agriculture, and joining me now is Melissa Dumont. She's the Executive Director of the Animal Nutrition Association of Canada. Welcome here, Melissa.
Thank you. Thanks for having us.
Okay, so ANAC, as we'll call it, what is this organization? There's probably a lot of people who don't know that this organization exists. So what is it? What do you do?
So ANAC is the National Association for the Feed Industry. So we represent all different segments of the feed industry, the commercial feed manufacturers, as well as the ingredient suppliers, consultants, other services, goods and services to the industry. That is all what makes up ANAC's membership. Okay. And our role is to really work at the national level and work for our members when it comes to many things, government and relations, to ensure that they have the best business environment that they can to be able to produce the best feed for our farms here in Canada. So we do a lot of other things that are not regulatory and not government related to support our members. But a lot of the work that we do has to do with ensuring that they understand the regulations that they need to follow, and that they also have a voice at the table when there's consultations happening or there's different parts of different regulations that are going to impact their business, that we're the voice for them at the table.
So now this, of course, then is why we're having this conversation today, in that there has been a new set of regulations published. So in Gazette II, which is where a final regulation is published for Canadian rules. This has been, and maybe you can fill us in for those who haven't been following along, and you can be excused for having not, because we're talking over a decade of some of these changes being worked on. So something like 14 years. So these new regulations are out. First, let's start with sort of how we got here. This has been a long process. Where are we at now? How did we get here?
Yeah, well, we like you said, it was a long road to get here. And, the late 2000s, it became very clear as an industry that we needed new regulations to be able to best serve producers and provide the best feed for their livestock. Our prior set of regulations dated back to 1983. And the way that we feed livestock, or we fed livestock in 1983, and the role that we needed government to play in protecting that industry was very different than it is today. So in 2010, our association decided to write a white paper with the intent to present it to the government to present a case to modernize the feed regulations. So talking about the challenges with the current regulations, as well as providing them with ideas and solutions on how that could be remedied. So in 2011, we got the great news, the announcement finally from the president of CFIA, who was George Dumont at the time. He told us, you know what? You guys have a great case. We're modernizing all of our regulations within the government, but you guys are at the forefront because you not only came to us with problems or complaints, but you also came to us with solutions that are very well aligned with our thinking. So at that time, we were told this was going to be a 1 to 3 year initiative. So thinking worst case scenario, we're done in 2014 and off to the races we go with our new suite of regulations. Fast forward 14 years from then, or 13 years from the 2011 announcement. Over 20 consultations, public consultations later, we are finally at a stage where those regulations that we were hoping for back in the early 2010s have been published. And that happened on July 3rd of this year.
So I'm sure that we could do an entire discussion of why it took that long.
Yes.
Or we can just refer to a government's 3 to 4 years is actually 14. But
that's about right. Yeah.
That's about right. Okay. So we're here now though. So let's dig in then a little. So we do have this new set. They've been gazetted, which means this becomes the new regulations that this industry abides by. Thinking back to sort of what was proposed and perhaps now what has been set as regulation, what were some of the major things that ANAC, that the Feed Association wanted to see changed in the regulations?
Yeah. So our base for these regulations was really to focus on feed safety. We all know feed safety, safe feed makes safe food. It's good for animal health. It's good for the products that the animals are producing. So our main focus to government, or our main ask was, can we focus on feed safety? The previous regulations focused a lot on nutrition, very basic nutrition, which in 1983 was potentially needed. Nowadays, we all have nutritionists that work for feed mills that are very well educated and experts in their field, and they're the ones that follow the science and are most up to date. And even the previous regulations, I'll call them that. I've been calling them that for not even a week yet, but the previous regulations used to dictate the nutrients that we had to put in feed. So a minimum amount of nutrients and a maximum amount of nutrients. And the minimums were really a problem because in some cases we actually had to add extra nutrients in feed that didn't need to be there. We knew with knowledge and education it didn't need to be there. Either it was being provided with some on-farm forages or on-farm grains, or just those animals did no longer require that amount. So we really wanted to modernize, really bring focus on feed safety, focus on innovation, bringing new products to the market, and get away from the nitty-gritty nutrition work that is evolving on an annual basis. We're always learning more about nutrients and about how to feed livestock. And when it takes 41 years for regulations to be updated, that's just too slow. It doesn't follow the science. So those were really some of our focus. And glad to say that we still have maximum nutrient levels in place with the new regulations, which the purpose there is to ensure that we're not going to have an animal health issue, a food residue issue of too much of a certain nutrient, or an environmental issue. And that's really focusing, again, on safety, right? Making sure that, we're not putting too much in where there could be safety concerns. And that's great. That's right in line with what we wanted all the way back, from 2010, what we asked for.
So now so obviously you represent the feed industry, so feed ingredient manufacturers, and that side of who's actually putting together supplements and different feed, et cetera. From a farm level, farmers will check tags and those sorts of things, but you're right, many are using, either the services of perhaps their feed supplier to work with a nutritionist to balance a diet or make a TMR, those sorts of things. But those tags, I'm going to assume, will still exist. But
absolutely,
the minimums. So you're saying though the minimum for some things where there were rules as to a minimum amount of certain things, will that go away, or will that simply just not be required anymore to be included in those feeds?
So it's not going away. Like you said, every label, every feed is still going to have a tag. It's going to tell the producer exactly what they need to know about that feed. So it's not changing at all. It's just changing. For example, if it said that we needed so much phosphorus is a great example. And I don't know how many calls I've gotten over the past 14 years about phosphorus and why is there so much phosphorus in feed when we're already having, some issues in our waterways, especially in the Winnipeg, Manitoba area. There was a lot of, frustration there. And so the regulations told us we had to have a minimum of X amount of phosphorus in a complete feed, in a complete diet, what the animal is going to eat at the end of the day. Whereas that's no longer there. And as an industry, we're obviously going to put what the animal needs as a minimum. We're not going to go underneath a minimum. If not, the animal would get sick. We would lose business. It's just not in anybody's best interest. So there's the nutrient requirements of the animals are always going to be met by the industry. We know what the animal needs. It's some of those areas where we actually had to put more than what the animal needed because the regulations dictated us to do that we will no longer need to be doing. But rest assured that all labels, all information that a producer is used to seeing, whether it's an ingredient that they're buying or whether it's a bag of feed that is ready to feed as a complete diet to their livestock or a supplement going into their TMR, that will still come with the label. You will understand what nutrients, what vitamins, what minerals are in there. The information is still there. And that's all part, again, of what we've asked from day one, feed safety. You need to know that information to make sure that your feed is going to be safe for your livestock.
Absolutely. Yeah. So now, and along that vein, will we see, or have we seen in these regulation changes, have we seen significant differences in, say, what's allowable as feed? I mean, certainly if we think back in the last 20 years, as far as what we can use for ingredients between species, et cetera, was there significant changes on that front?
So it's taking, yes and no. So, if we had an hour, I could go into all of the details of this. But the goal is to ensure that every ingredient that is used in a diet has to be approved by CFIA, by the Canadian Food Inspection Agency. So we're not allowed to use an ingredient in a livestock feed, and livestock includes poultry and aquaculture as well. It's all food producing animals. We can't use an ingredient unless it's been approved, and that means that they've done a full scientific review to make sure it's safe. So that doesn't stop. We need to make sure that it's there. What the regulations will hopefully do is help us bring new products to market, still being regulated and still being reviewed for safety, but bring us more aligned with our EU and our US counterparts as far as being able to bring new ingredients to market. Some of those innovative feed ingredients is what we hope. So that the regulatory system will be more favorable to companies wanting to come to Canada. Right now, it's extremely long to get an ingredient approved. The burden is very high as well. And so the burden of what they need to provide is all in policy, but the regulations hopefully will at least make things happen quicker. So we're not waiting 3 years for a new innovation to come to the Canadian marketplace.
Mm-hmm. And has that been a push from your membership to say, there are ingredients we sell, because I'm going to assume that you have, members that do business in other jurisdictions.
Yeah.
Has there been a lot of frustration as to what they can and cannot bring to Canada?
Absolutely. Yeah, that is probably one of the biggest complaints I get from my members is that they've got products in the EU or in the US that they're allowed to sell and use. And they've either tried to come to Canada and have been rejected, or the wait is too long. The reality, and we've got the same problem in the pharmaceutical world here in Canada, is our markets are much smaller than the EU and the US. So companies are obviously going to be more enticed to get a product approved in those jurisdictions where they'll have bigger sales. So we're hoping to be able to have that regulatory environment that makes the burden not so high. Burden's still there to prove science and prove safety, but not so high that it pushes them away from coming to the Canadian marketplace.
So thinking again to sort of from a producer's perspective, do you foresee, beyond the capability potentially of some companies being able to bring ingredients to Canada through a more streamlined system, do you foresee from a producer level any major changes that they would notice through these regulations?
So I don't think they're going to notice much as on a day-to-day basis. So part of this new suite of regulations requires us, anyone that manufactures feed and sells feed. So as soon as you manufacture a feed not for your own livestock, you're considered commercial feed mill, and you need to meet all of the regulations. So for us, a lot of the stuff is the same. Some feed mills had no preventive controls in place for feed safety. That is now mandated in the new regs. Through our program, we have a voluntary program that has preventive controls called Feed Assure here in Canada, and it's still above what is required by the regulations. About 70% of the commercial feed manufactured in Canada is already manufactured under that program. So those facilities, it's going to be a seamless implementation. They've had this in place for 10, 15, 20 years. It's just bringing the other people a little bit closer to that high level of standard of feed safety. As far as producers, any producer that's mixing medication on farm, mixing their own feed with medication on farm, will also need to have some kind of preventive control plan in place, which is a much more simplified preventive control plan. And that's just to ensure that you're not going to overdose your animals, you're not going to end up with food, drug residues in food. So that might be the only part that producers will really see if they are manufacturing their own feed and using medications in their feed. But for the rest, the hope is that it's just more of a, they have more access. We now are able to include veterinary health products in feeds, which we were not allowed to do with our previous regulations. So hopefully it's just being able to bring some of those great new innovations to the Canadian marketplace and give those producers that are facing a lot of pressures to reduce antimicrobial use, for example, some other tools to be able to ensure their livestock stay healthy and their production goals continue to be met.
Mm-hmm. So what will you do with all your extra time now? You had 14 minutes to recommence.
Well, we're going to say the next year and a half, we're going to be extremely busy supporting our members in implementing the new regulations. So for the commercial industry, there's a lot of changes that are coming, a lot of great changes. Some require them to change the way they view things. And so our association's focus is really going to be about supporting them so that they understand what the new regulations are. And the work's not always done as soon as the regulations stop. A lot of the regulations say you have to do this, this, and this, or we have to approve an ingredient, for example. but it doesn't say the how. And that all
Right.
comes down to policy and guidance. And so a lot of our work is going to be working with CFIA to ensure that the policy and guidance are realistic, are fair, and are science-based.
Mm-hmm. That is the one refrain that I think is really important to repeat, is that a regulation being published doesn't always dictate the how. So now
Correct.
we have to figure out the how. And I think that's an important thing to remember as individuals when we see our industries having to sort of take in some of these regulations and actually implement. So we'll see how that goes.
Yes.
All right. Well, then best of luck in the next 18 months in doing some of this.
Thank you.
Yes. And thank you so much for joining me on the show. This has been fantastic.
You're welcome. Thanks for having me. Have a great day.